Well, okay then. We are already at episode 58 of Space Rocks Uplink, and what an absolute pleasure it is to be joined by people from all over the world, and indeed Mark McCorcoran, who's beaming in at this very moment. Mark, how you doing? Are you receiving?
I am, Alex. Yes, I'm just going to futz with my audio just to make sure it's coming out in the right
Okay.
place.
Well,
That's good.
well, we can
We're all there.
good stuff. Well, we can hear you just fine, and it's set to be, I guess, a boundless conversation tonight because the subject of tonight's uplink is it's more than a medium, isn't it, Mark? It's almost like an incredible imaginative playground. We'll be diving in with some very special guests, but before we get there, I kind of thought, I should put the question to you as you are of the European Space Agency, among other things. What in the world are we doing talking to people from the world of comics?
That's a great question. And if you just go back to when I was a kid, at least, I think comics played a role in my kind of expansion of my mind with very early comics, Look and Learn, those sorts of things, which were comics from the 60s and 70s, which were partly about science and partly about the world around us, but also had comic series, comic strips in them, which were science fiction based. And then later on, and we'll one of our guests intimately involved in the iconic 2000 AD, which of course, yes, it's entertainment, it's storytelling, but there's an element of the pure science fiction exploring the universe around us. And that was a point where I was interested with a telescope on the roof of my house looking out into the universe. Now, there's only so far you can go with a telescope. You can look at the planets, you can look at the stars, but the comics and the novels I was reading at the time can actually take you there, along with the films which we saw in those times. So I think, comics, or as sometimes now called graphic novels, which I think is an important term as well, the marriage of the art and the storytelling together can be incredibly powerful. And there are some very creative ways of playing with that medium. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk about it this evening. It's something which has been a big part of my life.
Indeed. Well, it's a hugely exciting moment for me as well, both as a fan, but also because it broaches new territory for Space Rocks as well. Just an area of self-expression and ideas that we haven't really explored in a big way. And I can't imagine two better guests with whom to begin that journey. So tell us a little bit about who's joining for those who maybe aren't in the know.
Indeed. So we have two guests this evening. One is Dirk Maggs, and Dirk is an audio producer, radio producer, audiobook producer. He's worked on some, really very famous, I don't want to call them, iconic stories from science fiction. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which, of course, is very important to many of us. But also The Sandman, more at the fantasy end, Neil Gaiman's very famous comic book series, then converted into audiobook last year. And, of course, it will be coming out as a Netflix series fairly soon as well. But he's worked on hundreds of, things in science fiction and around fiction over the years. So sort of an adept master storyteller in getting actors to act out the written word into the spoken word. And our other guest is Dave Gibbons, and Dave is somebody whose work I've been familiar with since I was a kid. I mentioned 2000 AD. Dave was one of the artists that worked on that very early on, very famous for Rogue Trooper, but also having done many other bits of work. I mean, I've got, because I'm a geek, I have one of his early covers from, this is 1980. It's one of the covers he drew for 2000 AD. And has been involved in British comic books and comic strips very early on, but then became very famous, of course, when working with Alan Moore on Watchmen, which is still, I don't know, it's one of the best books I've ever read. And of course, it's a graphic novel. It's pictures and words, and I'm not ashamed to say that at all. It's an absolutely wonderful book, something I go back to quite often. But he's been involved in many other things, the Martha Washington series, and many other things which we'll talk about this evening. So it's just a thrill to have somebody that sort of drew pictures which I looked at when I was young and continue to look at, and the stories that can be conveyed that way. So Dirk and Dave, great guests to have on this evening. And they're good friends as well, so they make a good pair.
Indeed. Well, it's fantastic to have them on. We're going to bring them now. And I should say, beyond being influential in their own respective fields, It's surprising how many people have actually gotten in touch with me to say they are the reason why they are doing what they do for a living. So here they are. Dirk and Dave, how are you doing? We're bringing you in now. Are you receiving?
I'm receiving you loud and clear, Houston.
Fantastic. Are you there, Dirk?
I am here. Thank you, Alex. Yes, I am.
Brilliant.
Rather in the dark, I think, but anyway, that's only improving the situation.
It's astronomically related. It can be dark. It's okay. It's all right. Yeah, indeed. Well, look, gents, can I just say what an absolute pleasure it is to be joined by you both, and thank you so much for coming along to share some ideas. So I guess I wanted to start with a big question, Dirk. In thinking about the world of comics, why do you think it is in the year 2021 that the world of comic storytelling, in whatever form it is, can still go to places that other media can't? Why is it that it's still this remarkable and it's sometimes revolutionary playground?
It's kind of it's a playground for mavericks, really, isn't it? Comics. I think it was always where creative people who wanted to push the envelope could go and were able to work in a sort of slightly shadowy world back in the day. I'm not talking about now. And of course, Dave, will correct me, but the golden age of comics was a time when nothing artistically relevant was expected from it. So there was this kind of ignorance of the whole purpose was to tell a story, to entertain. The whole business of a comic is the last frame on each page makes you want to turn over to the next page. And yet in that creative pursuit, you are ending up with material that actually transcends the medium. You begin to deal with subjects that are, by the time you get to what Dave and Alan did, you get to the point where you're actually making it an art form that it never was before. And Neil with Sandman and Frank Miller and everyone else in the 80s. But certainly, it was heading to the point where it was a playground. It was a box of Lego that you could just lose yourself in, both as a creator and as a reader. As a kid, I was hooked totally.
So Dave, when you started in this business, I wouldn't, you're a little bit older than me, so I wasn't reading comics much before. Well, all right, but I'm not exactly young myself, so it doesn't help, does it? But the kind of comics I started reading were indeed 2000 AD and things like that. But you must have been reading things long before that. And so what was the motivation to become an artist yourself at that point? Was it about the storytelling, or was it that you had a talent and it was a way of expressing it?
No, it's always been about the storytelling. And to come back to what Dirk was saying, the wonderful thing about comics was, they're very low overheads, very cheap and cheerful to produce, a way to reach many, many people with a very cheap product that actually required the minimum of technology to do. I mean, a piece of paper and a pen. And that struck me very early on when I looked at professional comics, that really the only thing standing between me and being a published comic book artist was my talent. I had the means, I had the paper, I had the ink, I had the pens. So it seemed an achievable goal. And yes, in later years, comics have become kind of respectable and the kind of darling of the media elite, But I still like that slight grubbiness, a cheap thing you could roll up and put in the back pocket of your jeans that people discounted as being rubbish and trash and juvenilia. Because in a way, you could fly underneath the radar because of that. You could get away with stuff that was actually quite subversive. But as far as when I was growing up is concerned, and things that influenced me, I've got something. I've got actually a short anecdote about a space rock. Could I tell you a short anecdote about a space rock?
Sure.
And it does answer your question in a way. I can remember being at school when I was about maybe 8 or 9 years old, and we had an art class, and the teacher said, "You can draw and paint whatever you like." So the boys started drawing racing cars or footballers, and the girls drew ballerinas and ponies and things like that. And the teacher came over to me and said, "Oh, this is interesting what you're drawing, David. What is it?" I said, "Oh, please, miss, it's a spaceman, and he's been manacled to an asteroid and left to die." She said, "Oh, that's interesting." And what this actually was my youthful appropriation of an image drawn by the king of comics, Jack Kirby, from a comic called Race for the Moon. And this is a scan of the page that I nicked. As you can see, man manacled to asteroid and left to die. And I was hugely impressed by this. And when I found years later that Titan Books were going to do a collection, a reprint collection of these comics, I said, "You must let me write the introduction." And they said, "Okay, fine." So I wrote the introduction. And upon publication, the editor phoned me up and said, "Oh, Dave, you may or may not know that the original artwork to that story is for sale. You could buy it in an auction if you wanted." And it's like the holy grail. This was the thing that encapsulated comics, science fiction, something a bit shady and a bit seedy. And so I got my art agent to bid in the auction up to the limit of what he owed me for the piece of artwork. And I was successful in getting that piece of artwork. And I now have it hanging above my monitor. It's a bit complicated for me to turn all the equipment around, but I have got a scan of it. And this is it, the size it was drawn. It's called Space Garbage. And I also like the idea that it might just be garbage, but it is a man manacled to a rock, left to die. And it is the holy grail. It's the actual thing that kind of was one of the things that turned my life around. And I actually own it. So just had to get that off my chest anyway. But,
well, I'd love to get a scan of it, because there are some people that I work with who I just, conceptually, the idea of manacling to an asteroid just seems like just the right thing.
It's a fantastic idea. I think if I was a space criminal, I like to think that's the kind of death I'd like to engineer for somebody.
I've got a sort of parallel to that, because, talking about when Dave talks about the sort of grubby, stick it in your back pocket thing, which we all did as kids with stuff that we loved. We went to the comics shop or the bookshop or whatever. I'm sure kids still have done it with the Harry Potters or whatever. But it's very much the equivalent of being under the bed covers with your headphones, and like a Walkman or your radio, or nowadays your phone, and losing yourself in a story. And Eric Sykes, the comedy writer and performer, said to me once, he said, I love radio drama because there's nothing quite like being in your warm bed listening to someone at sea in a cold night trying to pull in the sail on the mainmast of a tall ship. And I do think there is that sort of pleasure. There was this thing about being told a really good yarn, and I can't agree with Dave more about the fact that really we are storytellers in whatever medium we choose to work with. And he uses a pen or whatever, and I would use a microphone. I don't know, but without stretching that metaphor to snapping point, I do think that there's a real thing about the story is the thing, losing yourself in a story, and maybe it's only when you're young, but I don't know. I don't seem to have grown out of it. The more extreme and graphic the story, in a sensible way. I'm not talking about shock stuff, but the idea of pushing the boundaries, which is why sci-fi is always such a great discovery. If you're reading, when you start to discover Heinlein or Asimov, I don't know, whoever, whatever you like, Stephen Baxter, it kind of, you can lose yourself in a world of possibilities. And that's really, I think, where it all comes together for me.
Before I hand back to Alex, I just wonder though, and I was picking up what you said, Dave, do you think that stuff was necessarily disposable? I mean, the fact that I can pull up one of your covers from 1980, obviously I've kept them hanging around. I've got several hundred of them. I'm not a kind of geek collector. I don't have them all wrapped in plastic, and I'm not going to sell them. They're just because I enjoyed them. Do you think though that it's become imbued with an additional seriousness that sometimes undermines that ability to be subversive?
I think to address the thing about collecting old comics, in the days when I was getting into comics, it was very hard to get hold of American comics. The distribution was very spotty. And so part of the fun was to get on your bike with your mate and cycle all over the neighborhood trying to find a newsagent's or a fags and mag shop that actually sold comics. And we actually got to the point that in one of the places we frequented, the guy would hold off cutting the string on the bundle of American comics until we rolled in and would let us cut the string and choose which ones we wanted. And there was a rivalry between us as to, well, you can have Flash, but I want Green Lantern, you know. So that's a whole part of it. And having something that's collectible that you can have a set of in a way to show your love of it, your appreciation, your high regard for it, I think is part of the interest. So I love that private universe kind of thing, and I know exactly what Dirk means. I remember again when I was a kid and I was getting into music as well. I had a crystal set, and the thing about a crystal set was you had to have a really long aerial. So when I'd gone to bed on a Saturday night, I would unravel my aerial and sneak open my window and throw it down the garden, and then I'd listen to the kind of fading sounds of Radio Luxembourg, or I particularly remember Pick of the Pops, I think was with David Jacobs at 10 o'clock on a Saturday night or something. And it was really something special. And my parents had no idea. And that's part of the charm of these entertainments, I think.
I was thinking when you said about cutting the string on the comics, the smell of the smell of the paper and the ink, and that it was sort of sealed in since it came out the factory. And without getting too weird about this, I used to love the smell of recording tape. So
I bet you do.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah, here we go. Conversation downhill.
That's nothing personal, Dirk, you know.
Thanks, Dave.
Okay.
Love you too.
I'll say, and I think at this point I should probably apologize. My dad might be watching. You know, there were at times I remember as a kid growing up reading comics where I would think to myself, do they know what I'm reading? Right. You know, and so I wanted to kind of take it out of, the world of comics just for a second, because as it happens today, August 19th, it's what would have been the 100th birthday of Gene Roddenberry, right? The founder of Star Trek, and frequently a show which is credited with introducing so many powerful ideas. You know, I mean, not just interesting ones, but also powerful statements on society, in its own perhaps now quaint way and all that. Although I've always kind of felt like comics were a step ahead as well. I mean, they were a step ahead of any other medium in terms of introducing new radical ideas. You know, maybe sometimes it just seems, wow, well, that's just a bit transgressive, or other times, wow, that's really enlightening. You know, that's a powerful idea. Do you think they still have the power to carry those important messages?
I think so. I mean, just to jump on that one, and another thing that I loved when I was a kid was Mad magazine and Mad comic, and that was deeply subversive about the consumer society. And in fact, you know, someone once said that in a way to the counterculture of the 60s, that it wasn't the initials LSD which were important, it was the letters MAD. So many of those underground cartoonists had grown up reading Mad magazine with its satirical take on established characters, established products, even things like supermarkets. You know, they had a whole satire about that. And I loved that idea of being able to be subversive. And I think, if you look at something like Watchmen, we actually managed to sneak full frontal male nudity in there, and nobody blinked. Nobody noticed. We thought, here we go. This is going to be trouble. Nobody blinked. So if you handle it in the right way and for the right reasons, you can get away with anything in a comic.
Well, you made him blue. I mean, yeah.
Yeah.
Here he is. Yeah.
Absolutely.
So in that sense, I mean, if we talk about Watchmen for a minute, I mean, it's such a storied story, the way it's developed from the 1980s until today. But take us back to the genesis of that. I mean, Alan, I've read some of his books. I've read other of his graphic novels. I mean, I don't know if the right phrase is a disturbed mind, a certainly enlightened mind, but there's something there. But how did you work together on putting that astonishing series together? How did that? What was the
show run? How much longer? You can all night. Make another cup of tea at this point, Dirk, because here we go, mate. Well, I mean, I think what I would say about that is that Alan and I grew up in very similar ways, although clearly you would never mistake us if you saw us together as to which one was which. Me being a little bit older than Alan, I was a mod growing up, and Alan was a hippie, I guess you could say. But we loved the same comics. We both had a similar experience where we'd gone to a friendly little local primary school. And then because we were smart Alex, we got transferred to quite a classy kind of private grammar school kind of environment in which we both struggled at one point, but comics were our kind of lifeline there, and again gave us a sort of slightly sardonic idea of what that kind of establishment was really like. So we grew up having similar experiences and reading the same kind of comics. I think what Alan's supreme talent is to analyze things very closely, to look at characters and think, okay, what would they really be about? What would be the really convincing motivation? And with Watchmen, the question was, if superheroes were real, what would the world really be like? That was the central question. And indeed, not long into it, I realized that what we were doing was in fact not a superhero story, but was an alternate world science fiction story. And the minute I saw that completely changed certainly what I thought it was about. But it would be, to answer your question in full, would be rather a long answer. But I think to say we started from the same position. We were great friends at the time. We both had supreme trust in what the other one would do. Alan famously said that when he realized I could draw anything he asked me, then he knew that I was the man to do Watchmen. So yeah, and I mean, at the time, the way we did it was in much the same way that I did amateur comics when I was growing up. It was doing something with a pal that was great fun to do, that we had no idea that we were going to do anything revolutionary or anything of a milestone or whatever kind of hyperbole you want to attach to it. We just did it for the fun of doing it the way we wanted. DC Comics more or less left us alone, hence the blue penis. We just had a huge laugh doing it. I couldn't have asked for anything more pleasurable to do. And the incidental fact that it's made an impact on the history of comics, which is the medium we both love, is just an added bonus, I think.
I mean, it wasn't the first thing you worked on. I didn't realize this until I was looking back. I think you did do something in 2000 AD together, right? It's unfortunately, it's a hole in my collection. There's just one missing, and it's whatever it is. Well, Prog 176 or whatever. I just had a look.
Well, what 2000 AD used to do is to give new writers and artists a chance by illustrating short little or writing and illustrating short little kind of twist ending O. Henry type science fictional stories, either called Future Shocks or Time Twisters. And Alan at that point was trying to break into comics. So he submitted a few short scripts and they divvied those up to different artists. And I happened to get given a couple of them. And they were amongst the best things I ever had to draw at 2000 AD, even though Alan was only just breaking in. And there was one particular story called Chrono Cops, which was about kind of Dragnet, the TV series, but set in time and space. So they could go backwards and forwards and arrest wrongdoers, but drawn by me very like a mad comic spoof, the same page layout, the same kind of lettering, and it involved going backwards and forwards in time and all the paradoxes of having to hide behind the potted plant because you were about to walk through the door and nobody could see you together, or they know that people were time traveling. You know, quite a convoluted thing. And that, I think, was the specific thing that made us ambitious for Watchmen, to try and do something equally complex over a whole slew of issues rather than just a short story.
Yeah,
indeed. Well, sorry, Mark, it sounded like you're going to say something there.
Yeah, well, no, I was just going to, I mean, it sounded a bit like the TVA in Loki, which is on, you know, that kind of a time travel series. But, I mean, and I won't go there in detail, but I do worry that Alan is also, he's got he's a Faustian pact of some kind. He's looked into a crystal ball because he has written the world that we live in V for Vendetta. I mean, it is exactly where we are, it seems to me. The current government is right there in that novel. But Dirk, so jumping over to you, so Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, also a really important thing to me when I was a student. I went to university and everybody, young physics students, 1979, we were listening to it on the radio. So how did you get involved in that? You know, was that something you listened to at that time, picked up the novel later, or what was your story there?
I left. I went to teacher training college because I couldn't think what I wanted to do, and I thought I'd be an actor. So I thought if I trained as a drama teacher, I could do some acting in Winchester, what was King Alfred's College, and I could also do teaching when I wasn't acting. And then I discovered that I was A, a terrible actor, and B, a really rotten teacher. And this was a bit of a blow to my plan. But the person the year above me joined the BBC. So as this thing called a studio manager, which was basically kind of operating the tape machines and making the tea. And eventually you got to operate the soundboard. And so I joined the BBC. They took me in. God knows why. And I joined in July 1978. And of course, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had premiered that March. And all the instructors at the Langham, what is now the Langham Hotel, was then a BBC building. It was a training establishment. All they could talk about was Hitchhikers and how wonderful it was. And it immediately got a repeat. It was such a success. So I listened to it. And at that time, my head was more into drumming. I'm a drummer in my other life. Hence my T-shirt.
Hey.
And yeah, always wear a drummer that you're about as good as. So, so I listened to it and I thought, I don't know, it's like Doctor Who with jokes, really. It missed me completely. Anyway, it was a couple of years later, I was doing night shifts for the World Service, and when it was quiet at night, no one was invading anywhere. They had a bunch of tapes you could play, like bloopers and what have you. And somebody had got all the Hitchhikers. They, recorded it off the ring main, and I listened to it and I thought, God, this is actually really clever. So that was when I got it. And then, it was an unattainable dream to be that funny, that technically proficient. It was only when I became a light entertainment producer myself 10 years later, and started playing with noises. And actually we did a docudrama about Superman's 50th birthday in 1988 called Superman on Trial. And I came up with a device where if we put Superman on trial, we could mix both the imaginary and the real and indulge my love of comic books and my particular love for Superman and DC Comics, because I always think Superman is always a better character than he's written for. It's a bit like the Marx Brothers. He's never in anything quite as good as he is. And so we did this thing and it was great. And we had Superman on trial. I'm getting back to Hitchhikers, I promise. And so we had Stuart Milligan played Superman, who was in the dock in kryptonite chains, being defended by Lois Lane and prosecuted by Lex Luthor. Obviously, there was a really good night school in Metropolis for would-be lawyers who had other jobs during the day. And we had this list of witnesses, and we had witnesses which included, on one hand, Jimmy Olsen Say, on the other hand, Jeanette Kahn, who was the president and publisher of DC Comics at the time. It was sort of mixing them up. We had Adam West giving evidence to support Superman as a character witness, and Batman, who met Adam West as he left coming into the courtroom and came up and gave evidence that Superman was actually a bit dodgy. And we had this other bloke, we had a writer of comic books, some artist called Dave Gibbons, who came and gave evidence and turned out to be not a bad actor, actually, to be better than I was at college, Dave. And so we did this, and out of that grew a series of The Adventures of Superman. And Douglas Adams heard it. This was around 1990, 91. And Douglas was trying to find somebody who would take the 3 novels he'd written after Hitchhiker had been 2 radio series and a television series and then hadn't done much, and take him back home to radio. And he heard Superman and thought, I might be the bloke to do it, because Jeffrey Perkins had gone off to telly. So I kind of was at Douglas's house before he put the phone down, really. He phoned my boss and opened the door, and Jane, his wife, said, come in. And actually, no, Douglas answered the door that time, because he was incredibly tall. I was sort of looking up his nose, really, to speak to him. And we chatted, and anyway, we were going to do what became the tertiary phase. That was Douglas's idea, call them phases. But it all kind of went a bit pear-shaped. The contracts between the BBC and his Ed Victor, his agent, weren't didn't quite work out or something. Anyway, the thing didn't happen for another 15 years, by which time, sadly, he died. But we had the original cast ready to go: Peter Jones, Simon Jones, Jeff McGivern, Mark Wing Davey, all of this. So eventually we made it. But of course, by then, dear Peter Jones had died as well. So we had to use William Franklin, who was another great voice of the era. But then we made the last three books Douglas made into what we called the tertiary, quandary, and quintessential phases. And they were received, they had mixed reactions from Hitchhiker fans, because they felt, this is a box of Lego that should not be opened and played with. But on the other hand, over the years, I think they've gained more acceptance because people realized we were trying very hard to do what Douglas had asked us to do, which was to, fly the flag for his wonderful story. And I have to say, after all these years, at the time I was worried about doing it. I wasn't sure that it was the right thing to do, but I'd been asked. It was a bit Blues Brothers, really, kind of mission from God. But actually, sort of about 5 years later, when we actually did it as a live tour, I thought, no, we're keeping the flame burning. And if I can continue briefly, one of the nicest things, there were two lovely things that happened. We did the show as a tour, and although financially it didn't do terribly well second time around, not through any fault of Douglas or the material or indeed the cast, but it just sadly didn't quite finish the tour. But while we were touring, one of the joys of it was, and I was determined to be there, so I played the drums in the band, and then I ran down and helped with sound effects. But there were times when I could just watch the audience, and people would bring their kids. They'd turn up in dressing gowns and towels, and their kids would come in dressing gowns and towels. And we didn't know how this stuff would play live, because Hitchhikers never had an audience. It wasn't an audience comedy show. But watching the audience, there were these kids of, 10, 11, 12, just falling about at the jokes. It was totally, it was for them fresh and new and different, and they loved it. And the very best night was the Mayflower, Southampton. Douglas's mum came to see the show, and Jane, his half-sister, brought her. And Jane said his mum came into the foyer, so I dashed down to say hi. And his mum was looking around at all these people in these towels and dressing gowns. She said, terribly worried about this. It looks a bit like a cult. And I said, honestly, Jan, it's the nicest sort of cult. They're all lovely and they all love Douglas. Oh, well, she said. And Jane said, look, if it's not going well, I'll take her home. And if it is going well, we'll see you in the pub afterwards. So, okay, fine. Anyway, got to halftime, and there was a message from Jane, 3 texts during the show. She said, Mum is loving the band. So I thought, good. The second one was, Mum is laughing at the jokes. And then the last one was, it's end of first half, Mum on her feet and clapping. So I thought, oh, we're in. And then we all met afterwards. And Douglas's mum said, and this was the best bit. She said, my husband and I, my second husband and I, used to try and listen to this, but it was at 10:30 at night, and we used to fall asleep before it ended. So I didn't quite know what was going on. But I was in the theatre, and everybody was laughing at what Douglas wrote. I had no idea he was so funny, and that was just that was it. The kind of.
Well, I actually experienced this from the audience when you played my local town, and it was brilliant. It was so enjoyable, and the kids, as you say, were enjoying it, and all the original fans we were all sat in the audience, all mouthing along with it.
Yeah, they were.
They knew the book. They knew it completely. Sadly, I didn't get a part in that particular production, but there we are. That's showbiz.
This is a recurring theme, folks.
It is. He's trying to keep me out of Sandman. I'd be great in it. I'd be fantastic. But he just won't have me. He just won't have me. I don't know.
Just waiting for James McAvoy to get a sore throat and you're in.
I'll hold you to that. I'll be listening.
Well, I read an interesting archaeological theory once, which was that comics are sequential art, right? That they're one of the oldest forms of storytelling there are, in some sense, if you look at like the cave paintings in Lascaux and elsewhere and so on. And something that's come up over and over again on this conversation is that, it's always about the story, whatever the medium, if it is audio, if it is comics. What do you think it is about these seminal stories like Watchmen, like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? What gives them that enduring quality that means that, decades later, people are still revisiting them over and over again? Is there a common thread?
I think the real common thread is, and I think almost without exception, the people who did things like that really enjoyed doing them, did them without calculation, did them just because they had a good yarn and they wanted to tell it to people. And I think the audience knows when you're coming from that kind of place rather than doing something exploitative. And of course, that's always the worry when you do sequels or add on to things or mess around with them, that you're going to kind of damage the original, which is why I think the fans are often resistant to that kind of thing. But I think if it's done with heart, and obviously you can tell from what Dirk said, it was done with heart, that kind of more or less guarantees its success.
I'd like to go back to what you said, Alex, at the beginning about this is the anniversary of Gene Roddenberry. 100? Did you say 100th?
Well, it would have been his 100th birthday. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, but what's interesting, Neil Gaiman said something interesting once, which was that he really thought that by now the future would be Star Trek, that we would all get on, there'd be the world government, that, racism and everything else-ism was a thing of the past, and, people were good to each other, and there was a general common purpose to sort of go and seek and find good things and what have you. Excuse me. And I think one of the things about the all stories, I mean, even the dark ones, because Watchmen has got a lot of dark moments in it, God knows, there's some real gritty stuff, but there's kind of a thing where it's about, there's a future, there's always a future, and there are choices, and choices can be made. And it's that when you come up with an idea like Star Trek or Watchmen or The Sandman or whatever it is, you're looking at possibilities, you're exploring avenues of thought and of endeavor. And the underlying message kind of is that, nothing is set in stone, everything can be changed. We are all here to progress in some way or another. It doesn't always work positively in the stories, but there is always a sense of moving forward. And so I do think that's a really important part of why it's why I do what I do. I assume there's, for Dave as well, it's kind of exploring places. It's going and looking and finding, because the undertone surely is, how do we change things for the better? I would have thought.
Well, there is a school of thought which says that science fiction is a kind of evolutionary thing, which is there to prepare people for the future, to show them what the possibilities are and show them, in a sense, the options that are available. And certainly something like Star Trek, which was subversive in one way, was the most moral, inclusive kind of show, which really set the agenda, I think, for the space program. And I mean, it's really interesting when you see Neil Armstrong. I nearly said Neil Gaiman because he gets everywhere, but when you saw Neil Armstrong standing on the moon with his spaceship in the background, you'd seen that before. You've seen it on science fiction book covers and in comic books. There was nothing particularly surprising. We accepted it. Yeah, they've gone to the moon, of course. But of course, what was never predicted was that 3 billion people would watch it live on TV. It was always in the comics going to be some scientist and his sidekick who built the rocket and went to the moon. So that was amazing. And with the future, as it turned out today, the most massive thing is nobody foresaw mobile phones. The fact that any street scene now, everybody's talking to their phone. Everybody at every spare moment is doing that. So,
but Dave, you say that because Douglas thought up the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which you carry in your pocket, and
which was Google based, basically, I guess, wasn't it?
Yeah, I guess so. But it being a transmitting device, I guess, because it seems to me that like real life, I totally. What you say about the Neil Armstrong thing is so true. And it's like real life was playing catch up with what we knew would be the case. And it was like when they didn't named one of the space shuttles Enterprise, it was kind of like, yeah, because that's the direction it's all headed in. It's interesting.
And of course, that kind of thing obviously inspired a whole nation of students and school children to pursue science or to go into the exploration of space. And so here's another interesting, I think, an interesting side anecdote. Before I got into doing comics, I was going to be a building surveyor, and we used to have building construction classes, and we had this very venerable, very pleasant, very dignified older man who had been a bricklayer, was now a lecturer in building construction, and he taught us all about buildings. And he was actually the character that I had in mind for the older night owl in Watchmen, the guy who'd been a cop and was a good, dependable, solid guy. And his name was John Hodge. Now, the thing that I didn't find out until much, much later was that this John Hodge had a son also called John Hodge, who worked for NASA and who was absolutely instrumental in the Apollo space program, and who, incidentally, to show my age, recently died. I read his obituary in the newspaper. He died, his son, at the age of 91. So this was a guy who had come from a pretty, standard lower class English background and had reached for the stars and actually had been instrumental in putting men on another planet. So I think there's this wonderful possibility, the possibilities that have opened because of science fiction and fantastic storytelling.
If we jump back a little bit, I mean, one of the things which strikes me about the kind of work that you've both been involved in is that it also illustrates the essential absurdity of what it is to be a human being, kind of, this tiny speck of something in a universe that really doesn't care about us. I mean, if you subscribe to spirituality, maybe, but, from my perspective at least, we're here, we're gone, we see it for a while, and then, that's it. But it also seems to me that there's a really important skill in balancing, exposing the absurdity, a naked man sitting on Mars, right? I mean, what's more absurd than that? And that outward-looking positive aspect. And the point I'm trying to make, I suppose, is that so much of modern life is so, self-consciously ironic all of the time. It's a wonder we take anything seriously at all anymore. And I wonder if that actually plays into kind of the crumbling of society at some level. I don't want to be too dystopian, but if nothing's serious, then everything's sort of negotiable. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, I mean, just to leap to something else, after doing Watchmen, I worked with Frank Miller on a thing called Give Me Liberty, which was the adventures of Martha Washington, a young black girl from the ghetto, and her misadventures in the 21st century. And this by some... That's the very one.
Yeah.
And our watchword was that the future was silly and scary in equal measures. And there is something absurd about the way things happen in the world today. And somehow popular entertainment has got mixed with much more serious things to produce some sort of kind of hybrid nightmare. Although, again, I think as long as we are exploring possibilities and we don't get locked into anything too dystopian too thoroughly, which is always a risk, I think to be able to accept that there will always be change and there will always be the unexpected is the only kind of rational way to live, I think. Sorry, that's a bit on the back of a fact packet, that one.
Yeah, but the thing about, we're talking about a culture in which where creators are followed in greater numbers than ever they were. There are exceptions, but you're looking at people like Dickens or Byron or whoever. There's always been literature that's inspired people and made them want to explore imaginary worlds. But the power of imagination, and I think this is what Neil does in Sandman, that the power of imagination is the engine that drives anything we achieve on the planet. I think it's a dearth of imagination where you have people who all they're interested in is lining their own pockets at the expense of others, a lack of humanity. And I think it's probably the remit of popular culture for some of us to try and redress that balance and say, being kind, being considerate, doing stuff for others creates possibility rather than impossibility. It's not pulling up the ladders and leaving people.
Yeah, I think the great danger is to, as it were, ban new ideas, right? You know, there's enough new ideas. We've got all the ideas we need. We know how things are now. I mean, that's the only thing, in a way, that gives hope, you know, that there's always going to be a better idea. I think the real danger area, and I sometimes think that those of us who deal all the time in fiction are quite tuned into what's reality and what's fiction, is that when people believe fiction to be real, that's when I think you're seeing a lot of the problems that set us today. People who can't draw the line between what's a crazy theory and it's amazing to me. I used to think this with Chariots of the Gods, you know, Chariots of the Gods, everybody believed that God was an astronaut. This was some guy who'd read a Jack Kirby science fiction comic, not unlike the one I showed you earlier, and thought, yeah, this really happened. There were aliens, had a civilization under the sea. That's right. That, you know, because somewhere in their memory, they're tuned into that possibility. So I think it's great to be as imaginative as you like, but somehow to have an idea of where the hinterland is between the two things.
Yeah, losing yourself, because it's like people say to, I see, you know, actors I know, like James, you know, I've chatted with James about all sorts of things, you know, between doing takes on Sandman. And, you know, I'm saying, well, you're a Scot. What's your take on Scottish independence and all that, you know, and we had a really informed conversation. It was very interesting, but it makes me laugh when James doesn't do Twitter, but you know, when actors do Twitter and somebody says, you're just an actor, how can you know? And I think actually creative people, and this includes actors, actually know a lot of stuff because you do so much research and you do so much. Actors are a repository of the most interesting and possibly useless knowledge about things like, you know, riding horses and firing guns, but also they play characters who are extreme and they have to inhabit those worlds. And we live in a world where storytelling has become a weapon, has been weaponized by, you know, these sort of anti-vaxxers or whatever, you know, there are so many different factions fighting to deny provable facts that you realize storytelling can very easily become a weapon of sort of, you know, mass delusion. And I think, you know, as Dave says, if you actually deal professionally in fiction, one of the interesting things I do is try and find the reality in a situation with actors where we are, for example, I don't know, having the three in one, the Hecate talking to the Lord of Dreams, all of these nebulous characters. I have to find somewhere in there is a pair of dirty socks being worn by somebody. You know, you have to kind of bring it to a reality. But a lot of people aren't grounded nowadays. But I don't think it's the fault of fiction. I think it's that it's being manipulated.
Yeah, I just, before I hand back to Alex, I just want to pick up on that, because I think, you know, on one hand, as you say, there are maybe dark forces who want to push the world in one direction, and storytelling can be weaponized, exactly as you say. I mean, I wonder again about some of the things you've been involved in. Have you ever got to that point where you said, no, I'm not going to allow this property to be used in that way? I mean, I know there's a difference between you and Alan on Watchmen, for example, Dave, and I'm not saying it's wrong or right, but there's a point at which, you know, you would say, actually, I'm not allowing that. I'm not going to let, you know, Dr. Manhattan sell soda, for example.
Yeah, although, I mean, I don't see any great moral reason why he couldn't sell soda, and I don't necessarily believe that art and commerce can't coexist. I mean, obviously, when you put a lot of time into creating something, you don't want it to be mutated into something else without your knowledge or without your say-so. But unfortunately, with lots of things in popular entertainment that have been done in the past, the original creators have not really got a say in it, and they can rely on the goodwill of other people. And I must say, DC Comics protected Watchmen for a long, long time, and we were very grateful for that. But yeah, I mean, yeah, you have a certain responsibility. And I think, you know, you could use your position as a creator to further your own political agenda or to support certain causes or something like that. But I think the test of is it authentic? Does it come from the heart? Was it done with, I'd have to use the word love in the kind of broadest sense. And I think those are the tests. And I think people can tell when something's a cynical exploitation and when it's done from the heart.
Yeah.
I like to think so.
I mean, there's that one section in Martha Washington where Frank went all Ayn Rand on us, right? And the whole libertarian shtick, but, you know.
Yeah.
But then the band rushed it as well, right? You know, so,
Well,
you know, it was kind of a thing for a while.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a reasonable thing to explore. And I mean, I would have to say with Frank, you know, sometimes he is quite radical in the stuff that he does. And it isn't necessarily his voice that you're hearing in the character. It's him writing a character. You know, I don't necessarily agree. You can never agree with your collaborators on every single point by which you live your life. But I think as long as you're doing it for what I would call the right reasons, then, which is basically to explore an idea, then I wouldn't have a problem.
Yeah.
Indeed. Well, you know, it's interesting because on that point, Dave, you know, what you were saying was enduring stories all rely on, I suppose, an absence of cynicism, you know, just doing things from the heart and doing meaningful things, which of course is like the opposite of Hollywood in many ways sometimes, because they have to do things in a kind of focus group, kind of very marketing orientated way. And so do you think perhaps that is where the world of comics will always, you know, have that edge, just as I don't want to say necessarily like a pure form of self-expression, but it will always have the ability to kind of operate, you know, with that value system underpinning it all?
Well, I mean, it's very cheap to produce a comic book and get it to market, even more so with the internet, where you can either read it online or sell it online, or, you know, get people to join a Kickstarter or some kind of crowdfunding thing online, which people love because they feel part of the whole project then. But I think because of the basic simplicity of comics, you're always going to get more fresher ideas coming through because there isn't a lot of money at stake. I mean, if a Hollywood studio spends, you know, $300 million doing something, they want to be fairly sure that they're, you know, going to get some of that money back. So I completely understand that. But I mean, you know, there have been fantastic breakout successes from comics. I think of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, who were a comic book creation who took the world by storm and made their creators multi-millionaires. So, you know, ethics and morality aside, there is a tremendous scope to make money as well from comics.
So Dirk, let's jump, because the Sandman has come up a few times in a weird way, right? I mean, Dave is an artist and of course would, I think quite rightly, tell us that it's kind of hard to separate in the graphic novels the art and the storytelling. On the Sandman, that's exactly what you're doing with the audio book. You're abstracting the story from the visuals. How do you prepare for that? How do you do that? Is it purely through the voices and story that you create the world to absorb people, or is it a parallel story in some way?
It's an interesting conundrum, really, because very shortly after we finally started the process, a TV series was announced, and I realized that I kind of had to do something which would make what we are doing intrinsically, it would have to cleave much more closely to Neil's original ideas than I thought it would be originally. You know, I was wondering whether to update and so on and so forth. But as soon as a television series gets involved, you've got a creative team, things are going to change because it's a much bigger process. Audio is sort of slightly more intimate in the creative stages, and because I can work with Neil one-on-one, I can also say to him, can I actually see your original scripts to the artists? So that gives me an into where his head was at as he wrote them, and also into sometimes the quite poetic descriptions of what he wanted an artist to draw, which of course nobody but the artist will have read, because why would you? And so in a way, if you like, I took what he wrote and became the artist, but in sound only, which then is an interesting situation because I'm also able to see what the artist did. So obviously Dave isn't one of the Sandman artists, but if I'm looking at Jill Thompson or Colleen Doran's work, or all the other guys, Mike Dringenberg, Sam Keith, I'm thinking I'm not only seeing what they've drawn, but I'm also seeing where Neil wanted them to go with it, and I can kind of take what they did and what Neil did and synthesize that into a sort of, for lack of a better term, and it's a really clunky expression, but an audio movie. I can take the technology of telling stories on the screen, the sound technology, and turn it into something which, to all intents and purposes, creates images in your mind. And at risk of, getting very boring about this for people who know me, really all I do is, instead of taking that point of entry for the information, I go in the side door. And I don't proscribe what you see. I let your imagination create the images. And the beauty, they always used to say the scenery is better on radio. Well, in audio, we have cinematic backgrounds. We have layers of sound effects up to the Foley of the actual characters in front of you. We have big sound effects, we have small sound effects. There are sound designers. I sound designed the whole of the first series. We've had a team of sound designers working on Act 2, and we're just about to go in studio with Act 3. But it's all working to Neil's original script, really. We're cleaving very closely to what he wrote, and we're creating something which has, interestingly, a lot of people have really enjoyed, because some people find it hard to read comic books. It's some people actually just can't quite make the synthesis. They see the fantastic pictures, they see the words, they don't know which to look at, and they get in a pickle. And excuse me. And on this, it's been strange, because we've had people who can't read comic books, and we've also had people who listen to it with the comic book open, which is great. But then you get people who just drive, particularly in the States, if you're driving from Chicago to, I don't know, Sacramento, whatever, you're going to probably hear most of the Sandman, on the drive, if that's what you wish to do. And of course, a lot of people have just said, when I got to my destination, I sat in the driveway till the end of that particular story or whatever, because they're so lost in it. And that's the beauty of the medium I work in. I say it's a visual medium because in the end, the images that you're working with are in your mind. It doesn't replace what people like Dave does, because people have taken me to task on Twitter for taking it away from the artist. Well, we're not. We're all working on the same material. We're all in the same sandbox. We're just creating it in such a way as to, it's a damn good story. This guy can really write good stories. And the fantastic thing is you can lose yourself in them any number of many ways. But what I do try to do, and I have all the way, in the last 10 years, I've worked a lot with Neil, is be true to the source material. I really do believe in that. I don't think you should take liberties. So it's a joy, and he's been fantastic to work with.
Can I just say something? Thinking about this and knowing that I was going to be on with Dirk tonight, and Dirk and I, as you realise, have known each other very well for a good number of years. And I was thinking, what is there that is alike about the way that we both tell stories? And it occurred to me that the thing is that we both got a missing bit. Like the bit that you haven't got in comics is sound. You haven't got the mood and the drama that sound gives. And in radio, of course, you haven't got pictures. So you're really put on your mettle to be creative and express everything, despite the fact you're missing an important bit. And you then come up with something, I think, which is a kind of a hybrid, but which is as interesting, as the original way it was expressed. So, and I think the reason that people particularly find comics intriguing and radio drama, and I'm absolutely hooked on what Dirk's done with Neil on Sandman. I'm absolutely plugged in and listening to it, and one won't do. I'm binge listening it, and it's closure. It's what the audience does when there is a bit missing. they close it. They imply the pictures. They imply the sound or the movement or whatever it might be. And that's what I think is particularly compelling about these kind of hybrid story forms.
I just quickly saying, I couldn't agree more. I think we kind of overcompensate because we're working for one sense, but it's very interesting. At the end of the day, I like to veg out in front of the TV, but as soon as you turn the TV on, your brain your imagination shuts down. You can speculate about characters' motivations and so on, but basically it's just feeding it all at you, and all you do is just lie there and blur. There's nothing wrong with that. Television is a brilliant medium, and film I love, and all of that. But I love that when you read a comic and you see you read Watchmen and you see Dave does like 4 frames of Dr. Manhattan, and the character is holding pose for 3 of them, and then the eyes move in the 4th, and you know that Dave is telling you that something has occurred in that time, and it's him doing that is the same as me who doesn't have reaction shots. I can't do reaction shots in audio, but I can use pauses and I can use just vocal ticks in order to suggest something. When we first did last year, Act 1, I said to James, could you just give me a clearing of the throat here? Can you give me some indication of a reaction? And he said, well, what do you mean? And I said, and then he got what I was trying to say, which is, I can't get a reaction shot on you, but if I need to hear that he's thinking, and it's a bit like Dave's 4 frames of, sorry, Dave, I'm probably paraphrasing and you've never done this, but I'm sure that I've seen you do this with frames on a character. And we find ways to overcome our limitations visually. And in doing so, I think we plug into the imagination. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about what we do. And then, the fact that I get to be mates with these guys is super wonderful.
I think what's amazing about that, I mean, you've clarified it for me as well, is a book, a novel, just words, little black bits on a white page can create a universe. And in a way, because you're so much more invested, because you have to create so much more from it. I mean, I've had the feeling many times with books which I've enjoyed where you get to the last page and you close it and you think you've shut a world down entirely. There's a deep sense of loss at that moment because you were living in that world. I mean, okay, maybe you weren't reading the book non-stop. You had to go about your other life. But yeah, when you close that final page, when a book works, you've been a co-creator in that work. I mean, of course, stimulated by the brilliant creator in the first place.
I was going to say, I suppose to be a bit zen about it, nothing is something, like no pictures is something. And the space between the pictures on the comic book page, the gutter, as it's called, is the bit where the magic happens. That's where the reader implies movement or implies transition. And as you're saying, if you're really lost in a piece of fiction because you've got your eyes shut and you've got your headphones on, or you're following the pictures in the comic, it does transport you. And it's the thing, as I got older and as I've seen things that happen in the world that are sometimes not so great, that the ability to escape into a fictional world is not to be underrated at all. It's such a tremendously valuable thing, irrespective of how you do it. The fact that creative people can give you somewhere else to go and get lost in, I think, is one of the wonderful things about storytelling.
Indeed. And, it's that profound melancholy that comes at the end of a good story is, I think, something that anybody who's enjoyed either of your stories can definitely respond to. And so it's just been such a wonderful thing. I just wondered if I could just very briefly, tilt this metaphorical sandbox over and spill it all out for a second and turn the tables on Mark, because we before we go to some viewer questions, because we had some great ones come up, this conversation began talking about a man strapped to a space rock hurtling through space, and we talked a little bit about Apollo, just like the idea of a human being actually standing on the surface and how these stories can be predictive in some way. But Mark, I mean, the whole genesis of space rocks kind of came about because in many ways we felt like we're in a golden age of discovery. I mean, just the other week, 2 probes on their way to Mercury and the Sun did a gravity assist around Venus. I mean, just that very thing blows my mind. There are people orbiting the Earth right now, quietly. It's no longer a headline or whatever else. And yet, it doesn't impact in the same way as a billionaire getting off a rocket, in a Stetson or whatever else. I mean, Mark, I mean, isn't like the challenge an ongoing area to explore in science outreach to get people excited about these things? And why do you think that's so challenging these days?
Yeah, there's a sort of a metaphor here. I mean, I actually think that although people are excited about the idea of going to Mars, if you actually try to tell them exactly what it will be, really what it will be, they'll much rather just sit in virtual reality on Mars. I mean, they'll escape from the current world, but they'll actually go to Mars for free, for cheap. I mean, I think so. It's about the problem that we have in the real space game is competing with science fiction, is competing with the storytellers who can elide an awful lot of the dangerous and boring stuff. Think of the film Gravity, for example. I mean, it's a 90-minute film. It's pretty short. There's a lot of action. And the whole film would be taken up with Sandra Bullock getting into a spacesuit if we did it for real. So we are competing with fictional storytellers who are using our universe, and that's not only in the fictional sense, like the film Gravity, but also in the new space world. The vision you're being sold about, you'll have a pizza restaurant on the rocket that takes you to Mars, and you'll live there, and you'll have, you even if you can't pay, we'll take you there on a contract. You can pay your way, and you think, how do I even begin to compete with that kind of storytelling? And to some extent, we cheat. We do story, not cheat, that's not the right word. We also try to tell stories. So you pointed out, we flew past Mercury last week, past Venus on the way to Mercury. How do we make that interesting to people when it's just a bunch of stills? It's not Hollywood stuff because we don't have the bandwidth to send movie back from Venus like that. The spacecraft isn't equipped for that. We put music to it. And in previous missions, we've talked many times about the Rosetta mission to the comet 67P, and it's now 7 years ago we arrived there. We used science fiction as a way of illustrating the scientific goals we were engaged in, but we were not untruthful. We didn't say that humans would go there. We didn't say that that we'll discover the meaning of life. It was much more subtle than that. So it's a very difficult thing that we have to compete with, and there's a danger of overselling it sometimes, and then people turning around saying, I was just discussing last night with somebody saying, the James Webb Space Telescope, there's this logo I'm wearing here, which will get launched later this year. It's an infrared telescope, so therefore the images won't be great because it's not what humans would see. To which my response was, well, Hubble isn't what humans would see either, because we don't have 2.4 meter diameter eyes with big detectors that can collect all the photons. That's a kind of storytelling too. But how do you negotiate between true reality, if such a thing exists, a palatable version of reality, and the science fiction that others can go to? It's tricky, but if nothing else, having this kind of conversation provides me with inspiration of new ways to think about doing it.
Indeed. Well, me as well, certainly. And I guess on that note, it's a good answer. I wanted to switch to a couple of viewers' questions as well, if I may. The first one is actually for Dirk, just every single question here is premised with "I'm a huge fan of your work," so just assume that that's been said. But one of them is comes across that Sandman is a bit of a bucket list moment. Are there any others? Are there any other characters or worlds that you would like to broach and reinvent for the audio world?
Yeah, many. Yeah, but I could go all the way from Asimov to Jack Vance if I was going to go through the worlds of science fiction. I've had a chance to play in the Alien universe, which was lots of fun, which is because alien things are never about the alien, it's about the people. It's Wile E. Coyote, really, if you think about it. But there are a lot. In fact, we're having talks about doing something next year, which would be a lot of fun, and I can't talk about, but it would scratch one of those itches for me. But the thing is, I've written original material. I end up doing big tentpole stuff because really I feel my job is to show what is possible in this medium, and so I tend to be doing stuff that already exists as some kind of IP. But actually, what I'm actually trying to do is say, do you know how insanely great audio is as a storytelling medium? That's kind of where I'm at the moment. But I'd love to do original stuff, I guess, is my answer. But at the moment, the main thing is, Sandman has been such a success, such a phenomenal success in audio, that actually I think it's kind of, a little bit of mission accomplished on that front. But now, of course, we have the rest of it to tell. So there's a lot of work in store.
Looking forward to every minute of it, me.
Checks in the post, Dave.
Yeah. I guess you could call him Worms or Mr. Worms. For Dave, says, can you talk about doing artwork for Beyond a Steel Sky and for other artists working off of your designs? What was that experience like?
Well, that's a bit left field. Yeah, I mean, I'm usually known as a comic book guy, but again, just like my world and Dirk's world kind of cross and intersect in certain ways. So do comics and games, in that they're both telling stories in a very graphic way and in a very economical way and in a very to the point way, with maximum story, with minimum amount of words and illustration. So it's quite nice to work on video games, and I work with a friend of mine called Charles Cecil of Revolution Software, who Dirk's also bumped into along the way. It's very incestuous, this world we live in. We did a game back in the 90s, which was done. I did the artwork on an Amiga computer with a piece of software called D-Paint, which was actually drawing characters pixel by pixel with a limited palette and a limited number of pixels. And the game was very well received, mainly because the gameplay was fantastic and I had nothing to do with that. And eventually we did a sequel to it. And by eventually, I mean like 25 years later, we did a sequel to it. But this time we were able to do it in full three-dimensional movement and with a rendering style that was based on my art style, so that it looks like animated three-dimensional drawings rather than, flat objects moving. But of course, that is a lot of work. So I was the kind of lead designer on it, who I had to design the characters and the environments and then hand it on to people to finish and actually greatly improve and solve the problems with. And then I would get back the thing that I just sketched out with a pencil or a virtual pencil. I'd get back a fully animated three-dimensional version of it. So it was a really exciting thing to do, literally like seeing your dreams come to life. And again, that game has been very well received. I like to think the graphics have got something to do with it, but it still is a really good game to play. It's a point and click adventure game. But the thing about it that I really enjoyed, and the other thing that I enjoy so much about comics, and I'm sure it's true for Dirk in his world, is I love the collaborative process. I love to work with other people with a common purpose, and pool our talents to come up with something that's going to be of interest and appeal to an audience. And certainly video games do that for me. And it was a lot of fun. I believe it's going to be released on console in the next couple of months. It was on Apple Arcade, so you can download it from there if you're desperate to see it and play it. But I believe it's going to be on various other consoles any week now.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I mean, it's literally jumping from one dimension to the next, from audio to comics to games, and everything in between. Well, I got to say, that's probably about all the time we have. But Dirk and Dave, I got to say, on behalf of everyone watching, everyone at Space Rocks, and I suppose Mark and Eze as well, what an absolute pleasure it's been to meet you. You've inspired so many people, and so many people do what they do because of what you do. And actually, I should say the amounts of people I come in contact with at Eze, who are huge fans of your work, is absolutely breathtaking. And so I'm sure they've all gotten a kick out of it as well. So thank you very much for your time. And Mark, I mean, we did raise Roddenberry, right? What needs to happen.
Well, you've cut me off. I'm gonna ask one more question. I'm going to abuse my privilege as one of the co-hosts, because we've talked about sound a lot, but I'm just curious whether, Dirk, you've already said you're a drummer, but what role does music play in your creative process? I mean, I'm thinking of one of our previous guests, Alistair Reynolds, who's a science fiction author in the UK. And his stuff needs to be filmed. I know one of his stories has been filmed, but some of his books definitely need to be filmed or brought to life. Yeah. Brilliant. Of course, he's actually used to work for the European Space Agency. He left before I arrived, but we're good friends, and he's done some great stuff. But if you read his books, you'll very often hear his music or see his music represented on the page. I'm just wondering whether or not you kind of sneak in music, whether music is an inspiration or whether you try to screen it out when you're creating.
It's a regret I do have that I was offered the chance to learn the piano. My mum, my dad and my sister all played the piano, and I thought it was a bit of a sissy thing to do at the time. I really wish I had pursued that, because I do love music. And as far as music intersects with what I'm doing, it's weird. At different stages of the creative process, you want to listen to different things. If I'm writing, I can't listen to anything, any music, any spoken word. When I'm penciling stuff out and thinking very deeply about the drawing, I can listen to music that has no lyrics. When I'm inking stuff in, I can actually listen to full-blown drama. I can listen to what Dirk does, because the visual part of my brain is automatically doing what it does, leaving a big void to be filled by the music or whatever sounds I'm listening to. But I would have to say that Dirk was saying about actors pick up all sorts of irrelevant and abstract and unrelated facts. But being a comic artist and having spent most of the last 50 years sat in a room drawing, I've got so much trivial knowledge, worthless trivial knowledge. And I'd have to say that looking back, some of my finest pieces of artwork were produced listening to Woman's Hour on Radio 4. So it was a very odd marriage.
Very good.
I see it was worth asking that question there, Alex. So Dirk, for you, music, I mean, I'm just, because space rocks, music is a big part of what we do.
It's vital. I mean, it's totally vital. And actually, I don't know if this is, it's not a boast, it's just a fact, but I actually introduced Brian May to Patrick Moore, and which was a very fruitful partnership, because that meant Brian went and got his PhD, which was great. But I do remember a very surreal evening that when I introduced them, Brian had brought a lot of Queen albums around in vinyl, because he assumed Patrick probably didn't have a CD player. And we did end the evening, me sitting with the greatest, sort of one of the great guitarists in the world, and Patrick playing us his brass band music on a cassette player. All of us a little bit three sheets to the wind. So, music and science, music is a science. In fact, Douglas in the Dirk Gently, book actually, says that Bach is basically higher maths. But in terms of what I do, for a start, I've actually written most of the Sandman, adapted and therefore written the scripts to Sandman to Mozart. I find Mozart very conducive to writing. It's the mathematics of it helps me concentrate. But in the actual making of anything I do, music is so central a part. The first thing I said when we originally were doing the Alien things to Steve Carsey, who was then the sort of the producer at Audible, I said, look, we've got to have music, got to have a budget for music, because I had a composer in mind. And the composer I had in mind was a guy called James Hannigan, whose music I'd found on Library, and I'd used for all the stuff I'd done with Neil, with Heather Lama, who produced his music. I just picked out from the Library. I didn't know it was this guy. And then I went to do the music reporting, where you pay the person who's written the music, and it was all the same guy. So when it came to doing Alien, I thought, this, he's got this really atmospheric feel. And of course, when it came to doing Sandman, it was a no-brainer. And James Hannigan is a romantic composer of the old school. He's sort of Eric Wolfgang Korngold, Max Steiner, kind of Hollywood, big themes, big romantic themes, and just to die for stuff. And he's the sort of beating heart of the project. Music is, you can sound design till your ears go blue and make something sound amazing. And then a composer like Jim comes in and does something, just writes some simple piece. And it just, the emotion, then the color comes out, the emotion comes out, and so on. So music, central. And I speak as a drummer who only hangs around with musicians, that it absolutely is central to what we do.
Fantastic.
Well, that's great. It sounds like we've got lots of sort of friends and influences and overlaps in common. It'd be lovely to keep talking to you in the future. There's this is hopefully just the beginning. I mean, when we have the live events again, I think it'd be brilliant to have you come along, talk to the audience. Again, we have an audience from kids through to teenagers through adults. I just think there would be a lot we could share in that environment, and as I say, lots of collaborators who I'd love to point in your direction if so.
I'd be happy to, yeah.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you, Dirk. The last thing we have to do is embarrass you. As Alex said, Gene Roddenberry comes up. At some point in the past, we decided we would have a kind of a visual symbol for space rocks, and it involves the Vulcan salute, so live long and prosper, and rocks, space and rocks together. So thank you very much for coming on this evening. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you both, and hopefully we can talk to you again soon.
Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Be
Good
well.
night now. Bye-bye.
Cheers.
Okay. Well then, Mark, I think we've traversed every world of storytelling but TV and movies, which I think is just absolutely fantastic. I mean, I guess you could call them storytellers or also architects. I mean, these are people who they build our world.
Yeah, I think absolutely right. I mean, this ability to create a world, but leave space for somebody else to come into it. And I think that for me was a revelation this evening, something I probably knew but had never put into words, this idea that the kind of partial art forms, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but leaving space for people to insert their own creativity. I think so much art that we receive today is chucked at us, and with young kids, I've seen all the Marvel films, I've seen loads of films, and it's just at some point it's just too many pixels, right? It's just breathe, stop for a minute so I can absorb what's going on. And I think both Dirk and Dave are masters at creating that space for you to be part of the story. Yeah, and I'm gonna start looking at all the stories again that I enjoy with that in mind, because I think that will change things as well.
Indeed. Well, I mean, two masters. I do wonder how their influence might inspire some things in Space Rocks as well. We'll have to see. But Mark, as ever, an absolute pleasure. For people that join us regularly, next week we're going to be taking a little break, but we're going to be back in 2 weeks' time. So watch this space. If you haven't signed up to our mission update newsletter, go to spacerocksofficial.com and please do so. And Mark, as ever, an absolute pleasure.
Likewise, Alex. Thanks for watching, everybody. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.